안녕하세요, Cloud입니다. Hey guys, Cloud here. Today I want to talk about a video titled How to Learn Language Input, Why Most Methods Don't Work. And the title of that video is a little bit clickbaity because it doesn't really talk about why most methods don't work. It actually just talks about the one method that the person talks about, which is acquiring the language. So he talks about acquisition, basically comprehensible input. And while I agree with a lot of things that he said, and I'll go over them, he has 4 main points. He said that to learn any language, and he has a lot of research to back up what he says, but he says that the 4 main ways, or the 4 things that you need to learn a language, where's the camera? 4. Acquire language through context, which is comprehensible input, maximize input, so get a lot of input as well, which might be similar things. The 3rd thing was practice listening and pronunciation, and the 4th thing was you have to have a positive experience while learning the language. Obviously, you can say it might not be necessary, but it definitely helps. The premise of the video, I guess to summarize it in like a minute or 2, is that he talks about comprehensible input, where if I were to say like, أنا رجل, you'd have no idea what I'm saying. But if I would say, أنا رجل, and then maybe point to a girl and say, هي امرأة, you might start picking up some words. At least you caught أنا as I. And he goes over a few examples, and you might learn a couple words here and there. Then he also talks about maximizing input. He showed like if you were to read a book in your target language, and you're very trigger happy on the dictionary, you might not learn very much. You might spend like 30 minutes just on one page if you're looking up every single word, especially if you're in the beginner phase. But if you watch a TV show without English subtitles, without your subtitles in your native language, you can have subtitles in your target language, just not in your native language or any other language, I guess. So without subtitles, you're basically in the same 30 minutes that you might be reading one page versus watching for 30 minutes. You'll gain a lot more input in that 30 minutes. And a lot of it is going to be comprehensible because you know what's going on. You can see the character move. You can see the character do things. And that gives a lot of visual cues to stimulate learning. Now, you might not learn specifically in that moment, but later on, he quotes Barbara Oakley, where she talks about the diffuse learning mode, where you're not focused, you're not actually doing the activity, you're not studying language, but your brain is just starting to take all of that input that you did in those 30 minutes and start to parse them about and store them and do a whole bunch of stuff with. And that way, like, you wake up the next day and maybe you hear it the next time, or you know how to say it and you're like, oh, I don't remember learning this, but you did. The 3rd thing was listening and pronunciation. Obviously, that's very important if you want to understand someone who's speaking. So if someone's speaking, if you can't parse out the words, if you don't know what words he's saying, if he's speaking too fast, you can't understand. So you might be good at reading, but not very much at listening. I have this issue where if I'm reading, I can understand something, but if I watch something for example, without any subtitles, it's difficult for me to kind of follow the flow of the conversation. If there's Korean subtitles, it's fine, but if there isn't, it can be difficult sometimes. I definitely prefer reading the subtitles. But basically, he says to avoid that. He also talks about shadowing to help pronunciation and whatnot. Shadowing doesn't teach you the language. It just helps you with your pronunciation and your intonation. And then he doesn't really talk much about the positive experience. Now, he does say this, though. He says that flashcards or spaced repetition learning are not learning the language. And I disagree, and I know a lot of people would disagree because factually that's just not true. I don't remember the exact word that he said, but basically he was saying that that's not the most efficient way. And that's actually wrong. In terms of efficiency, it's actually the highest efficiency. You learn the word, you can learn it with a sentence, you have this spaced repetition that makes sure that it sticks in your head. And you can learn an excessive amount of words in a short period of time, or throughout, it doesn't matter how fast you're learning them, but you can in a short period of time, and then you can take those words and start using them, or you can start recognizing them when a native says it, or when you read something, or when you want to say something. So it's actually very, very efficient. If you look at the studies, it's probably the most efficient way. I agree with him that it's not fun. And that's why I don't do it, because it's not fun. I prefer doing something fun because it's more effective. Now, it's effective in the sense that I'm actually going to do it. So if you were to give me Anki or Memrise, I'm probably not going to stick with it very long. But if you were to give me something that I enjoy and just watch it, it might not be as efficient, but to me it's going to be effective because I'm going to do it over the long run. I'm going to enjoy it. So that's something that I've mentioned a lot, is that you might as well have fun with it. If you enjoy, if you're okay with it, you should do it. It'll these apps like flashcards, Quizlet, or whatever you want to use, it's definitely going to help you, and it's probably going to help you faster. But you don't necessarily need to do it to learn the language. I prefer to learn language a different way. That's not as efficient, but it's more fun for me. So that's my big issue with that. I think that if it's a course, right? If you're not doing this for fun, if you like really need to learn the language for some reason, and you don't care about whether you're having fun or not, then part of it needs to be comprehensible input. Maybe I wouldn't say like 80 to 90%. I would say maybe a third of it should be comprehensible input. And then you should have also another like 10-20% of doing this sort of spaced repetition learning, and then another 10-20% learning the grammar. Because you could acquire the grammar, or you could actually just study it. You don't have to spend too much time. You could have like a italki tutor or something just tell you, hey, this is the grammar pattern, this is how you use it. Use a couple exercises, you start getting good at it, you hear it a lot, etc. It's probably easier to pick it. It's actually more efficient to pick it up that way. So deliberate learning has its place. It's very effective. It shouldn't be the majority. It should be like 25-30% max, like a third of your thing max. And then you should have your comprehensible input, and then you need some sort of, or you don't need output, but output develops fluency. And if your goal is to be able to write in the language, then you should probably write in the language. If your goal is to speak in the language, you should speak in the language. Pretty simple. But that's pretty much my thoughts. I thought that the video was well made. He had a lot of resources that he was using, a lot of statistics. And he quoted a bunch of really cool people like Barbara Oakley, Steve Kaufman. And it was a well-made video. I just don't think that it's the only way to learn. It definitely doesn't mean that everything else is wrong. I think if the title was different, which says why most methods don't work, I would be okay if he just said this is the most fun method, or I don't know, whatever he wanted to name it. But saying that most other methods don't work isn't necessarily true, because there are methods that are actually more efficient. So if we're talking about working, other methods work weller, right? That's not English, but whatever. But if they're not as fun, is it really worth it? Is the argument. I actually agree with them. I think comprehensible input, learning through input with like limited amount of actual, like for me, I would study grammar, but I wouldn't really study vocab. But for example, reading and writing, you kind of need to learn. If you need deliberate learning to learn how to read hiragana and katakana, to learn like all the kanji, for example, in Japanese. You use Japanese as an example. So there's definitely a place and a time for it. It just shouldn't be what a lot of students nowadays do, or people who are just learning by themselves. They just open a book, they buy a book, all they do is the book. They just learn a bunch of grammar, a bunch of vocab. They do like thousands and thousands of words. Then you speak to them 2 words. They don't know what you're saying. They read a sentence. They don't understand it. It takes a long time to do it that way, and it's just not as fun. So those are my 2 cents on that video. I'll leave the link in the description below.